Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. Hello, and welcome to a new season of Brave New World. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to our newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. So how should we prepare for a future where increasingly intelligent machines do most things better than humans? How should we think about the role of education in this brave new world of AI and tech? Can we make ourselves robot-proof? In other words, indispensable? This is a major looming challenge for humanity. Joining me today is Joseph Aoun, president of Northeastern University and author of the book called Robot Proof. As a leader in the area of education and a scholar in linguistics, he's given the subject a lot of thought from two unique perspectives. He's going to walk us through how to think about education in this era of AI, both in terms of how we deliver and consume it. Joseph, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Well, so before we get started, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey until this point.
Well, how many hours do you have? You don't have much time.
I got plenty of time.
Okay, so
I got plenty of time, but I suspect you'll summarize it.
Shorten that. I'm now the president of Northeastern University. I'm a native of Lebanon. Studied on 3 continents in 3 different systems, in Lebanon, in France, and in the United States. Came here for my PhD and decided to stay. And this is, almost everything about me.
Well, almost everything. So tell us a little bit about what Lebanon was like in the days where you grew up there. I suspect it was the heyday. I mean, you're the third Lebanese person I've had on the show, so Lebanon is very well represented. But tell us about what it was like.
Well, I mean, it was cosmopolitan, multicultural, multilingual. As a matter of fact, I grew up in a bilingual family, speaking French and Lebanese Arabic. And, I went to a French school, Jesuit school, from the age of 5 till my master's. So that, that gives you a sense that it's very multicultural, cosmopolitan. And the first book I wrote there, I wrote it with, colleagues who were hailing from different communities, Christian, Jews, Muslims. And so once again, that's the flavor that you're getting.
I spent several years of my youth in Ethiopia, which in the 60s, which was also a very interesting place to be at the time. And one of the more memorable experiences of my life. So I suspect your growing up years were quite rich as well, just given how you're describing it.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, every environment you are born with is rich. What makes it also more interesting and richer is that when you live afterwards and you study and you work in different environments. As I mentioned to you, I went to France, I worked in France, I studied in France, I taught in France, and I came afterwards to the United States and I did exactly the same, studied in the United States, worked in the United States, did my PhD here and stayed here. It starts giving you a sense of the differences and the commonalities between the various contexts you lived in, and to value various aspects that we take often for granted. And the students that we have, are very global. We have students coming from all over the world, and it's always a great perspective that they have. For instance, to give you an example, I remember when we had the Ice Bucket Challenge in the nation. And you remember the Ice Bucket Challenge?
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
Well, some of the students hailing from Africa and from India told us we would never do something like that in our countries because water is so precious. We would do it, for instance, maybe with a little bit of rice. So that gives you a sense that we take things for granted, that we have water. And, when you start looking at the world, it gives you an appreciation of what each culture has to give and what each country or each context or each society is also missing. So that's beautiful.
It's amazing how, we just become just much more aware about the rest of the world at the moment. It was very different when I came. People knew very little about other parts of the world.
Yeah. Which is a plus, which is an enormous plus. And that's why, for instance, we want our students to go explore the world, and we are a global university and with, campuses in other countries, and also we have co-ops, which is a long-term internships in 146 countries. Why? Because, we want all the students, domestic and international, to explore the world. And no one is.
That's something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's something I want to talk to you about. But let's just back up a little bit and talk about your book, Robot Proof, which was published some 5 years ago. So tell us a little bit about this. What does robot proof mean, and what motivated you to write it?
Well, what is interesting is that you constantly interact with faculty, students here at Northeastern and all over the world. And it was clear that AI and artificial intelligence, in general, robotics, computing, etc., were changing the way we work and making many of us obsolete. And so the economists started debating whether we are going to see 50% of the jobs disappear in the next 20 years, and then some others said, no, it's not 50, it's maybe 40. Others said, no, it's 30. But there was a consensus. The robotics, computing, etc., are changing, and AI are changing, the workplace, and we are becoming obsolete. In fact, they are displacing us in many ways. And therefore, the question became the following. What is the purpose of education, or the mission of education, of higher education, is to help you become robot-proof. What does it mean to become robot-proof? It means that you will be able to navigate the changes that society is facing and that we individuals are facing. And we said robot-proof is a journey. You don't become robot-proof in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. It's a lifelong journey. And then what is the purpose of higher education from this perspective? Is to help you navigate this journey. So we said, starting from college, and frankly, we started from college, but we could have started earlier. But starting from college is, we asked ourselves, what does each learner, each student need to know? And we said, they need to know something called humanics. We coined this word in this manner. And what is humanics? Humanics is the understanding and the integration of 3 literacies. A tech literacy, namely understand machines and how to interact with machines. Understand data literacy, namely the product of these machines. And focus on the human literacy. And what is the human literacy? Is what we humans do that machines cannot duplicate. And what are these attributes? Some of these attributes are obvious. The ability to be innovative, creative, entrepreneurial. The ability to work with people in teams. The ability to be culturally agile. Leadership. Global, being global. So we said every student in their journey here in order to become robot-proof, have to understand machines and then and know how to interact with machines and focus on what we do that machines cannot duplicate well in the foreseeable future. Then it became clear that you can study all the books and the essays on, for instance, creativity and leadership, etc. It doesn't make you innovative or creative. So you need to start being in a real-world situation. And what does it mean to be in a real-world situation? This is co-op, those long-term internships for up to 6 months each, and the umbrella is experiential learning. We said, in your robot-proof journey, you need experiential education. And experiential education is the integration of the classroom instruction with the world experience. So our students go on long-term internships called co-ops, and we are as I mentioned to you, in 146 countries. And they are working with NGOs, they are working with various organizations, companies. And what do they learn? And throughout the United States too, what do they learn? They learn to interact with others. They learn about themselves, what they are good at, what they are not good at. They learn how to look at the world from different perspectives, the cultural agility. They learn about gaps that they see. And many often they come back and they say, oh, I see a gap there and I can launch a company or move into social entrepreneurship and move NGOs, and launch an NGO. So that, if you want, it's a discovery procedure. It's a discovery about the world, about ourselves. But how does it relate to being robot-proof? Well, those are attributes that we are exercising that are specific to humans. And experiential education allows you to practice that. But experiential education has another dimension. It allows you to do file transfer. And machines don't do file transfer yet. So what is file transfer is a word coined by learning specialists. It means that you take your knowledge from a domain and apply it to a completely different domain. And to give you examples, so if you are a co-op student in Bosnia, let's say, and we had an English student in Bosnia there doing co-op with an NGO, and there were snipers disseminating fake news saying that this bridge is safe or this street is safe, and killing people. And she devised a program to debunk the fake news live. So she saved lives. We asked her, so how did you do it? She said, it's easy. In English, what you study is to deconstruct the text. And I used the same technique, but applied it to fake news. And then built the software so in order to save lives. So you see, that's a phenomenon of file transfer. You're taking your knowledge from a domain, you couple it with the tech literacy, the human literacy, the data literacy, and here you are. And that's what we do that humans don't do. So what we said so far is simple. Robot-proof is a lifelong journey. Start by understanding machines and understanding what we humans excel at. But machines, you yourself indicated that, are getting better and better and will displace more of us. So we need to reinvent ourselves.
So, you've said a lot of stuff there. So let's just sort of peel it apart, right? Your timing was really interesting. And in the last 5 years, like since you've written the book, I'm actually just astonished at the pace of development of AI. Are you surprised as well?
No.
I mean, you're a linguist. You've sort of grown up with, you've been aware of the research in natural language. Are you surprised at the rate of progress in AI?
No, I'm not surprised because I follow that closely. I have colleagues working on it. I myself, as you said, I am involved in this field. And so you see the rate of progress, and it's going to increase even more. And, that we see it all around us. And, the question becomes, what is the impact on us? The impact is it's going to displace many people as we said before, their jobs are going to disappear. Our jobs are going to be transformed. Therefore, what do we need to do? We need to reinvent ourselves, as I said. We need to upskill ourselves or reskill ourselves. Well, who's going to do it? Well, universities don't like that very much. They look at it as a second-class operation. Continuing education, yes, it's needed, but not for us. I mean, the creme de la creme among the faculty, etc., will not get involved in that. So here we are. We are facing a situation where we need to reinvent ourselves. Who's going to provide it? I'll go a step further. In the United States, we're an aging population. So we are seeing every year that the number of students that are traditional undergraduate students, 18 to 22, is shrinking. So many universities and colleges are not filling their seats. And the trend is increasing.
So I want to add something to what you said earlier about experiential learning, and that is that university education is itself an experiential good. When MOOCs first appeared on the scene, massive online open classrooms, I wondered whether market forces would disrupt universities since these online platforms would provide education at a fraction of the cost. My colleagues and I invited Clay Christensen to a workshop along with several founders of major MOOCs to talk about the impending disruption. And it hasn't happened yet. Universities provide a complex bundle of things, but the overall experience is hard to replicate. But say more about the shrinking pool of applicants. And is this shrinking pool being replaced by other kinds of learners, like maybe older ones?
Well, the number of students, undergraduate students, 18 to 22, is shrinking because we're an aging population. But to go back to your question so there are less students applying to colleges. And you are seeing a phenomenon of almost winners take all. For Northeastern is one of them who received 1,000 applications for 2,500 seats. And your institution also has received many applications, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So why is it the case that we have a smaller number of undergrads, 18 to 22? Because we're an aging population. On the other hand, we are seeing an enormous increase of lifelong learners. By some calculations, up to 74% of the learners are lifelong learners. So the demand is there, and we have to provide opportunities for people to reinvent themselves. Otherwise, we being in higher education, otherwise we risk becoming like the railway industry. That's a metaphor I used before, where when they saw the onset of the airline revolution said, well, this is not us, this is not going to impact us because they are in the airline transportation. They didn't think of themselves as being in the transportation realm. Well, the same thing could happen here for us in higher education. Our mission is education. Our mission is not to educate 18 to 22 only, but to provide opportunities for people throughout their lives. So to go back to the theme of robot-proof, if robots and AI and machines are displacing us, we need to reinvent ourselves. We're becoming obsolete. So we better do it in higher education. And if we do it, we can't do it by the traditional ways, namely we build curricula and they will come. You have to go to where the adult learners are. And it's an on-demand approach. And you have to meet them where they are. and whenever they need it. But it can go a step further even. What you are tailoring and what you are designing has to respond to the needs of the learners and also the employers. So let me give you an example. In Seattle and Silicon Valley, where we were, the tech industry challenged us to find a new pipeline of talent for tech. How are we going to look at a new pipeline for talent for tech? We didn't know how to start. So we consulted with our colleagues, we consulted with the tech industry, they were all at the table. And then we launched a program called Align. So what is this program? People who studied history, English, philosophy, economics, chemistry, physics, etc., biology, and then they are in the workplace, but they want to reinvent themselves. So the employers will give them a long-term co-op, 12, 16, 18 months paid, and during this period, we get them into computer science, and they finish with a computer science degree. This, we didn't know whether it was going to work. It worked, and it allowed women to come into the tech field and underrepresented minorities to do the same. So some funders, various funders, from a philanthropic perspective, gave us fund to really work with other universities to do it. But what's the meaning of this example? There are many, many, many conclusions. The first is that what you studied as an undergrad doesn't determine how you are going to recreate or reinvent your own path. That's an example. Second, that you need to meet the learners based on what their needs are. And that's we meet them in their workplace, we are there with them, etc. And so you see, to finish the theme of robot proof is a lifelong journey. We're becoming obsolete. We need to reinvent ourselves, upskill ourselves, and reskill ourselves. And that's an enormous opportunity for higher education.
So do you think that higher education career models are largely broken at the moment?
No, higher education is uneasy overall with the notion of career. Many of my colleagues say we don't care about getting students ready for careers. What we care about is for them to be well-rounded.
Is this people in computer science and engineering, or the liberal arts, or everyone who says this?
I think you see many of people who are leading institutions saying that too. And in fact, I had some colleagues explicitly mention that. So in higher education, we have created a dichotomy between learning to live and learning to earn a living. This, if you want, is another remnant of the monastic tradition. Why are you opposing the two? Why can't you integrate the two? So by denying the relevance of looking at how careers are changing and how people are impacted, we are making ourselves in some domains non-relevant. And that's why people are saying, why am I going to spend a lot of money and end up unemployed? So the dichotomy between learning to live and learning to earn a living has to disappear. And we have to be also integrated in the world and see where it's moving and how we can be impactful. But let me go back to something you said, Vasant. You asked me about MOOCs. And why is it the case that MOOCs didn't disrupt higher education in the way that they should have disrupted higher education? And one of the reasons is the design of these MOOCs. So these MOOCs were put together by a consortium of various universities. And So suppose that you are a student in one of these universities, and you're a B student. You're not a superb student, you're a B student, let's say, for the purpose of the discussion. At the end of your journey, you'll be getting a degree from this university that played a role and is playing a role in building those MOOCs and creating those curricula. But suppose that you are a student who is not from these universities, and you take these courses, and you're superb, and you ace them all. What do you get? You don't get a diploma. You get a piece of paper saying that you did it. So already you have created a discrepancy, a two-class system. So how can you change higher education and claim that we are building democracy to the whole world in terms of learning by creating already from the onset two-class systems? It told us, and it tells us, that they need the residential model one way or another. Why? Because through a residential model, you are learning from your peers and living with them. And that is precious. That's what is missing for young people in the MOOCs. But MOOCs are not irrelevant. MOOCs are a tool that you can use. They are not a panacea, and especially with people who are lifelong learners. You can inject those aspects. So we have a tendency to say, this is a solution to everything. And then we backtrack because we realize that this is a tool, but not a solution to everything.
So I did go back and review our workshop on the future of education, which was in 2014, and I listened again to what Clay said. He didn't think that there was necessarily an impending disruption, but rather a potentially bigger market for universities among the current set of non-consumers, which is very large. The challenge is how and what's the product?
Well, yes. At the same time, higher education is diverse but not differentiated. And that's a risk that higher education is facing. So to explain what I mean by that, in the United States, we have private universities, public universities, we have religious colleges and universities, we have small liberal arts colleges, small thematic colleges, pharmacy, photography, etc., etc. And we also have for-profits and not-for-profits. So that's very diverse. And that's good because it allows us to offer different educations from this perspective, religious, non-religious, community colleges, etc. At the same time, when you look at the model of education being delivered, they are very similar. We tend to copy the leaders.
And are there too many of them, by the way?
Well, in some ways, the answer is yes, because many are closing or merging. So the marketplace, that is something that in higher education we don't like to discuss, is telling us yes, especially if the percentage of undergraduates who are 18 to 22 going to college is shrinking. So yes, if you look at it from this perspective, but no, if you look at it from the perspective of lifelong learning, because we're not meeting the needs. So what do I mean by we're diverse but not differentiated? We all follow the same curriculum, more or less. Whereas, take for instance Northeastern. Northeastern differentiated in itself with the experiential model by being the leader in the experiential model, integrating the classroom experience with the world experience. Now, why is it relevant? It's relevant because the students, when I'm looking at your institution, any institution, they say, what is the value proposition? What I'm getting at University X that I'm not getting at University Y? Is it only the brand? And the answer, it can't be only the brand, because you need outcomes. And the outcomes, are you ready for life? Are you ready for a robot-proof journey? Are you ready for the jobs that exist or could exist? You can quantify that. So we in higher education don't like to quantify or to focus on output measures. We are very good at building input measures. So we brag that we receive 90,000 applications for 2,500 students. And therefore, we know how to evaluate the students, but we say no. But the universities don't say anything in general about the value proposition of the output. That's what you need in order to foster your differentiation. What am I allowing you to do throughout your life and throughout your careers? So, we don't have many or too many colleges and universities because there is an enormous demand in terms of lifelong learning. If you restrict it to the 18 to 22, yes, we do have.
Yeah, I noticed that Northeastern just took over Mills College in California. Do you anticipate this to be sort of, are we going to see more of this?
Well, we already are in London. A college merged with us in London, and we are very fortunate to have Mills join us also in a merger. But there is a trend there. There is a trend. I can tell you that here at Northeastern, we receive a request for a merger, one request or two per week. And we essentially are very clear about, to ourselves and to the colleagues who are talking to us that the merger has to be a real partnership and has to be strategic for us. And that's why we're saying no to over 98% of them. But to answer your question, yes, there is a trend and it's accelerating.
So I want to come back to experiential learning, which, you've mentioned a few times, and I, take that as sort of one of your differentiators, right? That's kind of something you've kind of grabbed and are running with. What's the challenge there? How do you really implement and evaluate experiential learning at scale? That is, how do you know how well you're doing?
Yeah, I think you raised 2 points. First of all, can you scale it up? And the answer is yes, because our students, 98% of our students are doing it, and it's not required. Okay? And they do that, and they come here for this. Now, as I mentioned to you, we have put together a whole learning center to evaluate the efficacy of what we are doing, the experiential education. And so that's one way. But also the other way is to start looking at what the students are doing afterwards. For instance, over 97% of the students are employed in their field of study after 6 months. And that gives you an indicator immediately of the fact that there is relevance there. And why is it the case that they are employed at such level in their fields? Because they did the co-ops, and the co-ops allowed them to understand those fields, to see whether they want them, and also allowed the employers to see whether there is a fit, cultural and otherwise. So, those are some of the measures that you look at to decide whether you are impactful or not in terms of experiential education.
So I got the demand part, but I just want to sort of press a little bit more on the evaluation part. So how do you know how well you're doing and whether you could be doing better, I guess is my question.
You always can do better. By definition, we're a learning institution, and we never say we're perfect. Okay, but for instance, I give you an example of far transfer. Okay, in far transfer, learning specialists telling us that the best way to acquire knowledge is to apply it to different contexts that are remote from the original one. Okay, There are studies in terms of learning about that. Well, what is experiential education? Experiential education is precisely, it allows you to do that, to take your the classroom, if you want, instruction or knowledge, and apply it to very different contexts. And from this perspective, you are better prepared because you have integrated this knowledge and you have applied it to different contexts. Can you measure that? Yes, by looking at all these as evaluations that we have. We even have an app that we're building that will allow the student to see how they are progressing in terms of this knowledge integration, in terms of transfer, and in terms of mastery. So, that is something that you can do well.
In your book, you refer to Sir Ken Robinson's brilliant talk, his brilliant TED talk. And I must admit that the first time I heard the talk, I just laughed so much that I didn't really get most of the content of what he was saying. I mean, the guy could be a professional comedian, but the second time I listened to it, I was like, all right, now that I get past the humor, and I think my favorite part was Shakespeare's parents telling him to start writing properly, I sort of went back and I heard it again. I was like, that's, how do you really teach creativity? People need to know the 3 R's to be literate, right? I mean, reading, writing, arithmetic, which everyone teaches. But as you say, there's a lot of diversity among schools, but little differentiation. But can you teach creativity, or is it innate?
Yeah, look, I think we are not sequential as human beings. Look at a child. When a child acquires language, they're using all the clues that they have with them, okay? So that's point one. So we're not sequential. We don't start by saying we are, we need to master reading and writing, etc., in order to be creative. We do it, constantly, all together. Very clear examples. You have, throughout the history of the world, you have people who were illiterate, who created magnificent things, ranging from infrastructure to paintings. So to be sequential and say first you have to master reading, writing, arithmetic, and then you can be creative, no. The second point that you raised is even more challenging, because can you teach creativity? And the answer in many ways is no. What you can do is allow people to understand themselves, to understand the context that they are part of, and see whether there are opportunities to think differently, or to create different things, or to innovate. Well, in psychology, there is a difference between a shaping effect and a triggering effect. So, for instance, if a young person is malnourished, severely malnourished, they will not develop puberty. Well, you don't say food creates puberty. Food is a trigger. It allows you to be well, and the body then matures from this perspective, to use this loose terminology. The same thing happens in education. You're not teaching creativity. You're allowing students to explore and understand themselves and see opportunities. That's the beauty of experiential education.
So let's push on this a little bit more, because, as a teacher, I think I speak for many of my colleagues as well, we sort of do our best to keep adapting our curriculum, to sort of teach people how to think, is the way I put it. And, I'm fortunate enough that I don't need to worry about my students, because most of them end up, getting jobs that, where they make many times what I do, almost right off the bat. So I don't need to sort of worry about career. So I can afford to think in terms of, how do you think about something? While you were talking, this reminded me of a talk that James March once gave, the famous organizational theorist, and he'd done a lot of work on education. And he made this comment that it's not that universities or educators don't experiment enough. They experiment a lot, but don't get a chance to evaluate outcomes sufficiently. What do you think?
Well, in some ways, that goes back to what I was saying. We in higher education, we look at input measures, but we don't look at output measures. Well, so what are output measures? It's what we discussed, the impact that you're having. So if you design an experiment and you don't look at an output, you are missing the point here. So the question is do we experiment too much or too little? I think in some ways, if we don't look at the impact, which means the output measures, we are designing flawed experiments. So it's not a question of quantity, it's a question of design.
But I guess that's difficult, right? Because it's difficult to sort of know what the outputs are or to measure them, because it takes so long for things to happen, right? We educate people, we send them out, and then there's sort of an effect, and it could take years, and we never really sort of know, how did these people do as an individual, as a group, right? We don't seem to have enough.
Well, because that's called longitudinal studies. We are doing it for health in various countries where they have studies that go back 35, 40 years. Well, the same can be done and should be done. That's why you're not looking at the impact after college only, but you're looking at impact on a lifelong basis. And this is why, for instance, we are seeking to give every learner this app that will allow them to look at their progress and in terms of reskilling, reinvention, or knowledge. But that's a tool. But we have the opportunity to do longitudinal studies. That's what, universities are the best body that can do that. So let's apply it to ourselves.
I just wonder whether we do enough of that.
No, we don't do enough. We started by asking, do we have too many experiments? And we end up by saying, no, we have gaps. Gaps in terms of the design, and gaps in terms of looking at longitudinal impacts. And you said something that I want to go back to, Vasant, that was interesting. You said, I don't have to worry about my students because they get jobs and they make way more money than I do, so I can afford to teach them to think. When you talk to employers, and we surveyed that, they don't want people who are not thinkers, because they look at it as every employee they have is an investment, is a long-term investment. They want people in the workplace who are leaders, who are thinkers. And so that applies throughout, whether you need a job or you don't need a job. This is something essential. That's humanics in some ways. It's not a luxury.
By the way, do you think... No, I totally get that. And just to sort of follow up on this point that, I'm fortunate that my students get these great jobs. Are market forces putting a lot of pressure on the humanities? Are they sort of putting humanities on the back foot?
Look, what is interesting is that, as I mentioned to you, for instance, when we surveyed the market said, we do not want people who are versed in one field, in one dimension. And this is something that is very interesting and very important, because they want people who are, everybody's going to become obsolete. So if you master a field, 5 years from now, you'll be obsolete. So what is the value of having you as a member of the community? The value is that you are able to reinvent yourself, but also to think about opportunities that hopefully others are not able to think about. That's leadership in action. So that's the way they are approaching it. So the market, now going back to the notion of humanities and the market forces, once again, if you say to everybody, go into STEM fields, then people may end up being one-dimensional. And that's why we are saying humanics is the approach. Understand machines, understand the world, and focus on what we humans do that machines cannot duplicate. That means, practically, that every student in the STEM fields has to have a human literacy, and every student focusing on humanities has to also understand, the STEM fields. And you need to integrate them. And to give you an example, at Northeastern, the largest demand now is from combined majors, ethical AI, climate change that integrate policy, legal, ethical dimensions, etc. So those are curricula devised by faculty from different horizons, different disciplines. And those are the ones, we have over 197, I think, and those are the ones that the student want. So once again, we cannot pin humanities versus STEM. Everything we do has implications for human beings. That's where human literacy is key.
Yeah, no, that's very well put, Joseph. In fact, I give people sort of similar advice, maybe to broaden themselves and, go study philosophy, not just computing. It's nice to study computing because that's kind of the language of our future overlords, but it's also good to, study philosophy and know what a good question is. And I agree. I think that's very well put.
And I think we don't want them to go study on one side philosophy, on one side computer science, but have an integration between the two. And those are, for instance, the combined majors. There are other ways to do the integration. It's not siloed. We cannot afford to give them a siloed education.
Yep, indeed. So a couple of other things I want to touch on. And so I'll start with the Biden bill. What's your reaction to that? And the reason I'm asking this is, several months ago, I had a guest, Caitlin Zaloom, who's written a book called Indebted, where she talks about the huge burden of debt that students face. They take on this debt, and many of them are unable to pay it back. So, with that backdrop, you look at the Biden bill, you say, it's a good thing. You're relieving debt. What's your reaction to it?
My reaction is the following. This is an invitation for higher education to continue to work on reducing the debt per student. We measure that. The Department of Education measures that. So that's an opportunity to continue to reduce that in a very, very decisive and strategic way. What would be a disaster is for higher education to say, they relieve the students from this debt, so I don't have to worry about reducing the debt. No, we need to continue to reduce the debt of students in our institutions and not use it as an opportunity to stop doing that. And stop doing that means that, don't stop worrying about debt per student. So that's something very important. So for me, it's an invitation for higher education to continue to focus on debt per student and reduce it.
Something related, which is access to education. In your book, you mentioned the GI Bill and how it helped millions. I forget the number, but maybe 2 million veterans upskill themselves and get access to, a good education. Do we need something like an AI bill now? Because, as you mentioned in Robot Proof, as machines do more and more, and I'm actually personally just very surprised. There seems to be like an innovation per week these days. Eh? The sort of level of intelligence is exploding. And I just wonder whether college education now has become the equivalent of what high school education used to be. Just sort of the price of access. It's the is the price of entry
Look,
into any.
I think we're looking at access in a very restrictive way and restricted way. Access is not access to learning from high school to college, but it's lifelong. We mentioned we're becoming obsolete. We need to reinvent ourselves and upskill ourselves and reskill ourselves. That's something we need to do. Who's going to help us do it? So let me give you an example. In Singapore, every citizen, if you want, has an account for precisely reinventing themselves or reskilling themselves, upskilling themselves. In England, they have, and they are working on various measures that will require companies of this certain size to put a small percentage of the payroll to help people reskill themselves, upskill themselves, reinvent themselves, to fund this account. So essentially, we need that in order to allow citizens to flourish, but we need that in order to allow society as a whole to flourish. If we become obsolete, we become irrelevant. So if we need lifelong learning, our measures of access cannot be restricted to looking at one aspect from high school to college, but a lifelong aspect, lifelong learning access aspect. And this is something that we don't have yet formulated as a society. And that's an enormous opportunity for us in the United States.
So what do you think we can do? So what do you think we should do to get there?
Well, I think we are working with, for instance, Washington, with our elected officials, with various programs, various agencies, in order precisely to work on shaping something along these lines. Why is it the case that, for instance, we don't have for every citizen an opportunity to be advantaged if they decide to reinvent themselves and on a lifelong learning basis? Similarly, why can't we give corporations, companies, employers opportunities to help their employees do the same? So you need a kind of consortium involving the employers, the citizens, and the government. And that's what we all are working on.
So, Joseph, in the time that we have left, I thought I'd bring up a couple of other questions related to robot proof or being or making oneself robot proof. By the way, I wonder whether I'm robot proof.
No, I am not. I can tell you, I'm not.
Because I can imagine a future where there's, the robot actually does a much better job teaching than I do, and I'm the assistant, maybe.
Well,
maybe.
Depends. It depends. It forces us in the same way that the MOOCs forced many faculty colleagues to ask themselves, so when I'm teaching, what is my value add? If they have the knowledge on the web, what can I add? And they came up with great answers. And and the same thing is happening. The more sophisticated and the machines and AI systems are going to be, the more we have to look at how we are positioning ourselves as human beings with respect to that.
So let's talk about admissions. Right? You talked about sort of the input and how we measure that. Is that something where machines could actually help us? And let me give you some context here. So this relates to a conversation I had with Danny Kahneman about human decision-making and noise and bias, right? That people tend to be biased, they tend to be noisy. And this seems to be true in all areas of human decision-making. And I can imagine that university admissions are not immune to this as well, right? I mean, we do the best we can. There's a huge flood of applications that come into universities. Is there a role for AI to actually help people evaluate students?
Yes, there's a role, and AI is doing that in various universities. Okay. However, AI itself needs to be monitored because we know the discrimination that AI systems trigger. You know, if you are an African American applying for a job and you have exactly the same resume and you are Caucasian, you are treated differently by the system, by the AI system. Well, those AI systems have biases that need to be also cleaned. And this is where, for instance, humans have a role to play too, because we are biasing the system at the input level. And we have to be very clear that we have to control that and we have to get rid of it.
Indeed, indeed. It's interesting. This reminds me of something, and this maybe results from someone at the Network Sciences Institute at Northeastern. I think, it's this notion of like how humans think about errors that humans make versus machines make. And, we in many ways, we tend to be much more forgiving towards humans.
Well,
we say, well, I can understand that, but the machine makes the mistake. We say, no, I would never do something like that.
Well, in some ways, the fact that we are less forgiving with machines is good, because it allows us to assert some kind of control. And who's going to do it? It's the humans. Don't let them loose.
Indeed, yeah.
Don't let them loose. That's what you are saying.
Yeah. No, it's not surprising at all. So, last couple of things, Joseph, because I know you've got to hop. Do you think American universities are a force for global cultural change?
The answer de facto is yes, but it doesn't mean that we have the answers. I was talking to somebody in India, and he said, look, U.S. system of higher education is the envy of the world, but is unaffordable and unscalable and unadaptable. So if we look at that from this perspective, we cannot say we have the monopoly of higher education, and we shouldn't have it. And if we look at what he said, it's telling us that we should expect systems, countries, entrepreneurs to devise systems that are way more relevant for their societies, that can come and append many things that we do here in the United States. This is a phenomenon called reverse innovation, as you know. So innovation is not coming only from us. Innovation can come to us too.
What I hear you saying is that this is a major opportunity that is not being exploited. Or what I see my compatriot as saying is that American universities are the envy of the world, but you're catering to a very select few. And in Clay Christensen's world, I was talking about the fact that I went back and listened to what he had to say. He sort of expressed things in the following way. He said, customers form concentric circles, and the richest ones are in the middle, and the non-consumers are at the fringes, right? And American universities, for the most part, go for that middle, right? We go for that consumer that can afford it, and we sort of ignore that outer fringe, the non-consumption, right? And Clay's point was, you should go for the non-consumption, right? Because that's what you're ignoring at the moment. And the question is like, what's the business model that supports that?
I think we have to go for every learner and provide opportunities. Look, in describing what Clay said, it's clear that we left, for instance, the role community colleges play in this nation. Historically, they had played a major role in providing the first access And so we are not, and frankly, I mean, and they are not focusing on this circle of well-to-do people by definition. So if you look at the system,
You're sort of describing Tocqueville's America, right? The little, people would take charge of these things, and they fulfill the role. But I'm sorry to interrupt. Please go ahead.
No. Look, in a way, you can paraphrase what Vannevar Bush said. He said, "What's the purpose of research? Is to help us win the Cold War, is to help us have wellness, and to help us have a great economy." And if you look at it from, and lead fulfilled lives, he didn't mention the fulfilled lives. But if you look at the role of higher education, what is the role? Is to help us conduct a fulfilled life, including having options for careers, jobs, etc. It helps us also in terms of wellness because, and we saw that during COVID, the research that led to vaccines was based on what the universities did, and it helps us look at new inventions that will feed new economies and help us flourish. So that's our role. If we look at this role from this perspective, then we have an obligation to provide educational opportunities to our citizens.
So one last question, Joseph, before we wrap up. Two questions. I'll ask this one first. You've been president now of Northeastern for like 16 years. What was it like when you started? What's it like now? And what are the challenges you see ahead of you?
Look, when we started, we were not a global university. We built a global university system. As you know, we have campuses in Canada, in the UK, in the United States. And so we moved into a global university. In order to do that, we started globalizing the first campus we had, namely Boston. And we recruited international students. Then we helped our staff become globalized by sending them all over the world in order to understand it. And so little by little, our purpose is to build a global university system that allows us, this global university system allows us to provide opportunities for the students. For instance, undergraduate students can be mobile, can have an education in California that is different from the education in London and different from the education in Boston, differentiated. So they can choose to spend a year here, a year there, etc. So we moved from a university that is defined by its campus in Boston to being a global university. That entailed major challenges, and the challenges were all human. We had to globalize the community. And we did it step by step. So if you ask me today what my challenge is, what our challenges are the same. It's always the human factor. And that's the beauty of being in education, because we work with the human factor constantly. And that's why I'm optimistic.
So you're saying that you're on a trajectory, and that's the way you're going to continue to keep going.
Absolutely.
It's sort of this humanics.
Yeah, and the talent we need at all levels, whether we're talking about the staff or the faculty colleagues, the research, they all have to be breaking boundaries, changing the world and impacting it. So we cannot afford to copy anybody. We have to chart our own path. And and that means that when when we look at new talent that we're recruiting, we need this talent to be entrepreneurial, to be breaking boundaries, like the network sciences group that you mentioned, that we created, that we put together, not created, very early on, precisely, and they are doing that. So the beauty is that once again, you can chart your own path. You can think of Northeastern as a 100-year-old startup. that is reinventing itself in the same way that a lifelong learner needs to reinvent themselves.
So, Joseph, in conclusion, what's your advice to learners, lifelong learners of any age at the moment?
Always keep exploring. Never stop looking at opportunities for reinvention. It's needed, it's difficult, but the journey there can be exhilarating.
Thank you, Joseph. Thanks for your time. I really enjoyed reading your book, and I doubly enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you,
and I look forward to continuing this, perhaps over a beer sometime.
Absolutely.
And absolutely delightful to talk to
Let
you.
me remind you that a computer doesn't drink beer. Thank you very much, Vassan. It's great being with you, Vassan.
Thanks, Joseph. A pleasure. Take care.